welcome to the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. My name is Phil Schiavone. I work for the CCO, the Coalition for Christian Outreach, and I am your co-host today. But of course with me is Byron Borger from Hearts and Minds Bookstore in Dallastown, Pennsylvania. Byron, the host with the most to say about the books that you should be reading. How are you doing today, Byron?
Bill, I just love hearing your introduction each time. It makes me so happy to be the host with the most to say about books. I've got a lot to say about books, but we're going to keep it to three. So yeah, Three Books from Hearts and Minds, co-sponsored by the CCO. I'm so glad for your work, Phil, and it's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be here as well. And I'm always looking forward to the books that you have to recommend. And of course, that out of a mutual love, not only for God, but for learning and keeping our faith sharp and attuned to what God's doing in our midst. And, speaking of faith, there's a few other virtues of the Christian walk that I believe you want to guide us through here today. And I'll let you do just that. What's your first book for today, Byron?
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'll preface it by saying this. In our last episode, we knew it would be airing right before the election. As we're recording this now, the election is history. And we're in tumultuous times for sure. And the last Three Books from Hearts and Minds episode, we talked about civility, about talking well with one another, learning to disagree and be pleasant as we push one another onward in these serious conversations of principled conviction that is also diverse and honoring and civil. So yeah, I got thinking about that, how that is so urgent now more than ever, as good people have disagreed over the last months, but certainly now moving into the post-election season. And I decided I was going to talk about three books that are virtues that we need now more than ever. Those of us whose candidate lost are particularly urgent in needing some of these. But I think even if your guy won, no matter how you're feeling about the election, in the forthcoming time when half of the country is pretty much at odds with whoever you are, we all know it's about 50-50. So I think it's going to be important for all of us to have these very virtues. And the first one I want to talk about is a virtue of which there are 3 or 4 classic books over the years, but not a lot, on the topic of humility. And the first book is by Michael Austin. It is a book simply called Humility. It would stand over and with books like the classic by Andrew Murray, written over 100 years ago with the name Humility. But this one has an interesting subtitle. I'll read it to you. For those listening in on the podcast here, the subtitle of Michael Austin's book, Humility, is Rediscovering the Way of Love and Life in Christ. So it's a book about being in Christ, who calls us to a path, a way. It's called way because he's the only way to God, but also it is a way, a path, a way to live. So there's practices to follow his way, to learn to be a disciple in his way. And that way is primarily summarized by Jesus himself as love. So what does it mean to live in humility? Austin says it means to follow Jesus in his way, following his path, along his journey towards the signal virtue of love. So I really like this book. I'll just tell you some of the table of contents for those that want to hear about this. Austin is a thoughtful guy, mainline denominational writer with an evangelical heart. He's written about faith in the work world. He's written about virtues in the work world. He's an ethicist. Most recently, he wrote a little book on Christian nationalism and what's dangerous about idolizing your country over too much to make it into sort of almost like a god. So the idol of Christian American nationalism is his most recent book. But this humility volume, he calls it the neglected way. And then he has a chapter called Rediscovering Christ's Way. And he says we are a people of the way, so we do this together. The next one is practice of the way. So there's stuff we have to learn and do. And then he has a chapter called Preparing the Way, which is a great chapter, good for Advent particularly coming up, because it's preparing the way of Christ. And then the last chapter is Persevering on the Way. So this stuff about steps towards practices, ways to become humble, ways to reject false humility. There's people that say they can't even take a compliment. I'm not good enough. I'm a sinner. How are you? Better than I deserve, because I'm so bad. I'm such a worm. And he says that's, in a certain sense, it's a false humility because you're making the story about you, about how you're not worthy of compliment. And so you're expressing a practice of false humility by making the story about you. So he looks at false humility a bit, amidst the culture wars, amidst the division that we have. He calls us to this authentic way of Christ, which is a way of authentic humility and consequently then love. I'll tell you one thing that's good about this for moving not only in the post-election season, because he's savvy about our cultural conflicts, but also about the upcoming Advent season. Maybe we'll talk about those books next time. But he does talk a bit about the theology of Christ, second person of the Trinity, condescending to earth, that great famous passage in Philippians where Christ sets aside his privileges of divinity, whatever that may mean, and incarnates into human flesh, becomes one with this fallen world. And so this Christ-like humility that is seen in the incarnation itself. That's what we celebrate at Christmas, right? The God of the universe who made the world comes to earth. And so that very notion of who Christ is summarized in a certain sense best by this cosmic humility of condescension to serve. And then, of course, over and over again, he says, "Attend and be a servant to others." We don't reign in worldly power the way the world does, but we come as servants to others. So no matter what you think of politics and the partisan elections, that kind of servanthood is at the heart of Christian faith, and it leads to a humility where we model the own humility of our only King, Jesus Christ. So yeah, I like this book a lot. Rediscover the Way of Christ by Michael Austin. How's that for a starter? Humility, is that a good thing to start with here after the election?
It's an incredible thing to start with, and I think it's worth putting in the front here too, because I think in the research I've done, even recently around some of the other ancient religions that were in the air of the time of the writing of the Bible, those other competing gods had zero humility. They were
No.
all the other
Yeah.
competing gods were all like in charge of something, and you needed to appease them, and they were these monstrous gods, and we were pitiful humans, right? And our God has always been different, not just in the incarnate form of Jesus, but from the beginning, God was blessing us and letting us bear His image. And I think a deep exploration on humility is something that every Christian should do at some point in their life, not only about their character, but about their God.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Phil. And of course, the ancient Mesopotamian gods and the Babylonian gods and the Assyrian gods, out of which came about the time of our creation narratives, much has been written about that, how our God is a God that gives us dignity and worth because he's not that kind of a vicious God. But when you think of Jesus showing up with the
Hmm.
Herods and the Caesars, where they
Hmm.
demanded allegiance to the Lord of all, and of course, that's what got Jesus and his followers in trouble, because they would not bow the knee to Caesar as Lord. They'd pay their taxes and drive chariots at a good speed. They tried to obey the law where they could, but when push came to shove, they would not honor they would not honor Caesar as Lord. And so the whole kind of anti-empire theme of turning the world upside down that Jesus's kingship brought to a first century environment where the king demanded such utter lavish worship. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Our God is a different kind of God, and our Lord is a different kind of Lord. So that humility thing, I think, again, just to be honest, it needs to be front and center as we debate politics these days, because some of us are pretty sore about what half our fellow citizens did, and the other are like looking down their nose at their fellow citizens. So there's still a lot of turmoil, my sense is, here a couple of days after the election. And so being humble about it all, being open-minded about it all, the civility books we talked about last week aren't going to work if we don't capture this way of Jesus of loving servanthood and humility. So it's a long practice to be loving in this setting, but this book, Humility, is going to help. It's really, really good. For what it's worth, I know we're only talking three, but Richard Foster, the contemplative, wrote a book on humility a year ago. And I mentioned Andrew Murray's, which is a classic old one. So right there's three books just on humility. Let me move to a different virtue, and this is a virtue of hope. And again, many of us say we don't trust princes, Psalm 146. Don't place your trust in princes. They die and we move on. It's only the Lord who is the sovereign one who cares for the poor and the oppressed. And so even as we don't put our trust in princes, no matter what you think about the election, we all need a new revived sense of hope. There's a new book on hope. There's lots of books on hope, but there's a brand new one that's particularly eloquent, a little bit more academically rigorous than some may read. For some of us listening here, we like these kind of books. It is on Yale University Press, a very prominent, prestigious publishing outfit, and it's called Love's Braided Dance. Love's Braided Dance. The subtitle is Hope in a Time of Crisis. The author is Norman Wirzba. Wirzba, a Dutch Reformed name, now teaching at Duke. He's a theologian and spiritual writer, and he teaches at Duke. His main passion, and is what he's most known for, is agrarian, local agricultural stuff. His best friend, one of his best friends, is Wendell Berry, the poet and farmer. So Love's Braided Dance brings sort of an agrarian worldview of localism and care for the earth, recognizing climate change and so forth. We are in a time of crisis. Our culture is really maybe on its last legs in some ways. And so where do we find hope in the midst of the horrors of our day and age? Let me just read one little portion of this. It's a little heavy, but it'll give you why he called it Love's Braided Dance, because that's a line from a Wendell Berry poem. So let me just read a little bit for those listening in. Enjoy this. He says, the future of hope, I believe, depends on the activation of love. Love that is inspired by the grace of this life, love that is committed to the cherishing of our shared places. Love requires that we work to overturn programs of displacement and patterns of violation that leave people abandoned and abused. He started the book with an incredibly moving story about a guy who doesn't care about anything himself, and he was out fishing and in the Mediterranean, and some African immigrants were in a boat that was sinking, and people were drowning all around, bodies floating, and he took the hand of someone to help him, and it just changed his life as he grasped the hand of a dying person and tried to save more people than he could even get on his own sinking ship then, because he took so many people on, women and children and others. And so this moving story of us at sea rescue that transformed this guy. And that's some of what he's alluding to here when he says we need to overturn programs that are inhumane and violate people, that let them abandon. He said love requires that we reject the economies that render people desperate and alone, and instead develop the capacities, the sympathies and affections that will inspire people to create communities of mutual flourishing. As the biblical sage who wrote the Ecclesiastes put it, hope resides in our joining with all the living. That's a Bible quote from Ecclesiastes. Our hope is joining with all the living. This joining would be a loving embrace of each other and our shared places. It would be what the Kentucky poet and farmer Wendell Berry describes as a plighted life, a life in which people, by pledging themselves to care for each other, become braided together. And he quotes the Wendell Berry poem, the way I go is marriage to this place, grace beyond chance, love's braided dance covering the world. He says a love governs the way of hope. It is difficult to articulate because the way of hope is not linear, systemic, or smooth. It does not follow 12 neatly defined steps when taken in succession. It does not lead a person into a hopeful manner of being. Instead, it is often meandering and circuitous as people attempt to live faithfully and mercifully with each other. So his chapters are each an essay on these circuitous ways of practicing hope that helps people love one another better. He has a chapter called When Hope Languishes. He has one called Resident Hope. He has Hope Grows in Places of Belonging. He has two really strong chapters on forgiveness and links hope to this forgiveness granting that we do. Here's a chapter, this is fascinating, on architecture. It's called A Hopeful Architecture, and he literally looks at buildings and our sense of place. And then he has one on a hopeful economy. And the last chapter is called Learning to Dance. This book, which I've just started, it's brand spanking new, is really eloquent and thoughtful, a bit deep, by Norman Wirzba, who's a farmer that teaches at Duke and friends with Wendell Berry, loves braided dance, hope in a time of crisis. I just think I love the way he links hope to love, hope's love to forgiveness, and forgiveness to place, that we have these shared communities of flourishing where we're braided together, and that's where hope can come from. Sure, he's a Christian and he believes hope is what God is going to do and it's God centered. I mean, he sort of presumes that and he says that. But then what does that look like as we live it out? How do we compress sort of our hope into real practices of living in a fresh way? It's good. I think it's a fine work, and I'd recommend it to people.
Yeah, you landed on the plane right there on exactly what was appealing to me. Was oftentimes we talk about hope as this sort of internal opposite to worry, right? Or
Yeah,
internal
yeah,
opposite to despair. And the fact that he's able to not only paint a picture of the beauty of hope, but also the application in both personal and systemic ways is really intriguing to me and hopefully really intriguing to you, the listener, as well. So
yeah.
yeah, that sounds like a very unique book when it comes to hope.
Let me read a blurb from the back. You know, the artist Mako Fujimura is an evangelical reformed artist of some renown, and he's written about beauty and justice and all kinds of things. He has a blurb in the back of this. He says, peering straight into the heart of the darkness of our violent world, Norman Wirzba invites us on a riveting journey of hope. Love's Braided Dance choreographs a movement for a sacred dance of forgiveness with love and courage. So anyway, I just thought that would be a useful resource. The next I'm going to tell you about is exactly about all of these things. But if the first two were a little serious, a little mature, a little thoughtful, a little literate on Yale University Press, this one is fun and easy to read and packed full of stories. And it's one that many of our readers, at least those affiliated with the CCO and have been to our Jubilee conferences over years, they're going to know this guy because he's one of my favorite people and one of the funniest people on the planet. His name is Bob Goff. Goff wrote a book years ago called Love Does. The sequel is not as well known, Phil. I just think people need to know this wonderful sequel to Love Does. It's called Everybody Always. The subtitle that Bob gave it is Becoming Love in a World Full of Setbacks and Difficult People. There are setbacks galore. There are crazy people out there. There are difficult people God gives that he seems to have made particularly cantankerous. And we're called to love them. And what's it mean to just love ordinary people? It's a book packed full of stories, full of examples of what it means to love everybody all the time. I can't get enough of this book. I've read it twice. I've led a discussion group on the video curriculum, which is really fun. And so I revisited it again last night when I was thinking of what are the virtues we need in this hard time, in this season where we need hope and humility. And I thought love is sort of what both of these other two books are about. So I might as well pick one about love. And then I thought of Everybody Always. So I thought this is as good as a book as anybody. You know Bob Goff?
I do know Bob Goff. I love that his love is so infectious. Anytime anybody ever like catches wind of Bob Goff, whether that's his book or, one of his social media feeds, it seems to be all that anybody can talk about after first encountering Bob Goff. And that's definitely been my experience. My wife had the same experience hearing him at Jubilee a long time ago and then reading Love Does, and she could not put that book down, and it's inspiring the way he goes about not just the intention of love, but the creativity in
Yeah,
love. He just always seems to have this way of humor and balloons and
yeah,
parades and islands. I mean, you name it, he's
exactly.
experienced and given away love freely and generously and creatively in a way that is just infectious. It's just you want to then be more creative with your love and more intentional with your love after encountering Bob Goff.
Let me give you a little excerpt just so you can get a flavor of his writing for those that don't know. He says, as a lawyer, I win arguments for a living, but something has changed within me. I want to be like Jesus. I've concluded we can be correct and not right. Do you know what I mean? He says, I know this is most often when I have the right words and the wrong heart. Sadly, whenever I make my opinions more important than the difficult people God made, I turn the wine back into water. I'm trying to resist the bait that darkness offers me every day to trade kindness for rightness. These are not mutually exclusive ideas, of course, but there's a big difference between being kind and being right. Pick the most controversial social issue of the day, and you'll find passionate voices on all sides. The sad fact is, many of us have lost our way trying to help people find theirs. Arguments won't ultimately change people. Simply giving away kindness won't either. Only Jesus has the power to change people, and it will be harder for them to see Jesus if their view of him is blocked by our big opinions. So I think he's right about that, that sometimes, although opinions matter and political gestures matter, but there comes a time at the end of the day when we just have to give up our own attitudes and let people see Jesus, leak Jesus on them and show them his love. He tells a story in this book about going to a place like Chuck E. Cheese's. He doesn't use that name, but it's some big old ugly pizza place that gives away these free tickets, when you play games. And he talks about all this stuff he's done with his kids when they were little, and he got all these tickets. He finally takes the ticket, he has enough in a shoebox, takes him to the place to check them out, and he got a pencil. All his tickets, and the guy behind the counter counted my tickets once and recounted them to make sure he got it right, he says. When he was all done, you know what they gave me? A pencil. That was all I got in exchange for almost 1,000 tickets. And the pencil didn't even have an eraser. He said that would be 500 more tickets. I walked away mumbling, "Curse you, pizza dude." What I didn't know until I finally got to the prize counter was that all these tickets I'd been saving up for years were virtually worthless. He says people who are becoming love stop collecting tickets. They don't do nice things for Jesus thinking they'll get a bunch of tickets they can trade someday for an eraser full of grace. This is because they don't think grace is something we can trade good conduct for. They don't take the bait and collect what has no value to God. They shun all the attention because they don't need it anymore. They realize bright lights don't need spotlights. Instead, they see every act of selfless love as a declaration of their faith. They've come to see love as its own reward, simply because it pleases God. He says these are the same people who, becoming love, stop keeping track of other people's tickets too. Instead of evaluating what others are doing, they see them as people who are on their own adventure with God. They don't stop counting because they don't care. They just are so busy engaging in what God is doing in the world, it doesn't matter anymore. Now, what's interesting, the very next thing he does in here is he talks about a website that he started, creating this social concern thing that he does, starting orphanages and stuff in Uganda. And he says on that website, he admits here that he was changing a generation of children rising in Uganda. And he looks back at that and he says, a generation? There's like 40 million kids in Uganda and I have an orphanage for 500 of them? He said, what was I thinking? I was trying to make it about myself, trying to talk about how different I was going to make and what great work I was doing. And he said he was sort of ashamed that he felt like he had to puff himself up so much to make his good work, granted important work, look better than it was, just to try to make himself look good. And then the very next thing he says, he's serving the poorest of the poor, as if like the ordinary poor aren't enough. Like he has to stomp on them to get to the real deserving poor, the poorest of the poor. He said, again, I'm just making myself look significant, and I need to rethink my website in a way that is less puffy. I just like that Goff will honor those things, admit those things, talk about those things. He tells stories about people that he's met, people that are decent, good folks that he learns to love without judgment and just cares for them and gives love away. Like we got plenty of it. There's a story about balloons. He said he always takes balloons to places. He thinks there'll be balloons in heaven. So anyway, I just love this book. It's easy to read. It's fun. It's inspiring. And although it's about loving everybody, like his last one, Love Does, he moves into some deeper territory about the nature of the heart, the nature of the soul, the nature of your virtue, and the formation inside of the kind of people we're becoming. And whether we do these acts of love and social justice and transformation, whether we do them for our own ego or do them out of love's pure own commitment. So this is like what it really looks like to give love away and not for your own sake. So all three of these books, I think, Phil, the humility on finding love in the way of Jesus, the love's braided dance of hope in a time of crisis, and then this one by Bob Goff, who's always worth reading, but I think this may be his best and maybe his less well-known one, Everybody Always by Bob Goff. books about virtues that could be important for us, particularly in this time of contention in our culture. May we be people who have these kind of loving, humble, hopeful hearts, and consequently can make a difference in people's lives for real.
Yeah, wow. That's really, really good stuff, Byron. And I love the exploration that you just took us on, even in that summary there of the weaving in and out of our inner virtues with our external works. And I was even just contemplating the scriptures afresh in my own head as you were saying that. The New Testament seems to explore that. If you read the whole New Testament as a narrative, it's exploring this kind of back and forth between our hearts and our actions and who we consider when we love people and our religiosity versus,
Yeah.
our hearts and those sort of things. And so I was even just reflecting on the New Testament teachings throughout the whole of the New Testament. And I know that this also lands a little bit too with the title of your bookstore of hearts and minds working together. That's not we're not just brains on a stick, like Jamie Smith says. There's more to us than that. And so this exploration of virtues is not just one to. It can be a trapping in itself, right? We become more patient. We become the most humble, and it can be that. And I know that's not your aim, and that's certainly not the aim of the books that you've recommended to us. So I just want to thank you for that, and thank you for where you took us in processing there at the end too of what Bob Goff was saying and how the rest of these books point towards that devotion that we need to have to both that inner virtue life as well as how does that play itself out in our attempts to love others and live out this faith.
Exactly. Well, thanks, Phil. I always appreciate your comments. It's fun telling people about books and then hearing your feedback as well. It's an honor to do these things, and let's hope some people order some books and grow in these things and pass them out to others and keep this conversation alive.
No problem, Byron. And as you said, we do hope you order these books. The first link in the description of whatever platform you're tuning in on will have the link to the order form to order books from Hearts and Minds. And everything, all three books in this podcast will be listed at 20% off from Hearts and Minds. So we hope you not only order these books, but read these books. We want you to read them, and our emails will be on the bottom if you have any feedback for either of us. We would love to hear what you are thinking, not only about the podcast, but of course, these books as well, so that we can share that sort of feedback with others and continue to grow a community that's growing in both their hearts and their minds. Of course, if you love this episode, we'd love if you left a review, left some stars for us, as well as shared this episode with others to continue to help others get to know not only this podcast, but again, the great recommendations that Byron makes and the work of the ministry of Hearts and Minds Bookstore to all y'all out there reading books. So we thank you for listening to another episode of the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast.